If you're following along in your book, now we have moved on to chapter 22. So this is the origin of species. Really, I would say it's speciation, meaning how we get new species and also lose species over time. All right, so speciation is the fancy word for origin of a species or where it comes from. This can result from microevolution, which we already talked about, or which is, changes within a single gene pool. So that's when we did the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And then we also have macroevolution. So this is really above the species level. It has to do with cumulative effects of speciation over a long period of time. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's kind of micro, small scale versus macro, large scale. Okay, so key science philosophy would be the biological species concept. Species is a population or a group of populations that the members can interbreed. So as I mentioned previously in another PowerPoint, is the ability to interbreed is kind of the definitive characteristic. If they can breed with one another, they are members of the same species. If they are not, if they can't breed with one another and produce fertile offspring, meaning their babies can have babies, then it's not a species. And there is something called reproductive isolation that acts as a barrier to prevent members of two species from producing viable offspring. So populations can become isolated, and then over time, their ability to reproduce goes down and down until eventually they are officially different species. And these barriers can either be pre-zygotic, meaning before a zygote is made, or it could be post-zygotic, meaning after a zygote has been made. So pre-zygotic includes things like an embryo never being fertilized or never being made. So habitat isolation, meaning they are never geographically in the same place at the same time. Temporal, meaning they're never out at the same time. Maybe they have different mating seasons. Behaviorally, they might never interact. So they might have different mating songs or dances or something. Mechanical isolation, we will get into, that has to do more with sexual reproduction and the mechanics of it's just not going to work. And then gametic isolation, meaning that the egg and sperm are just not compatible. Whereas post-zygotic has to do with, great, a zygote was made, but maybe it's not fertile. I did mention that their babies need to be able to have babies. So if you have sterile offspring, then that would be an example of a post-zygotic barrier. So the idea that horses and donkeys can make a mule, for example, but those mules can't have children. That would be an example of a post-zygotic barrier. Okay, so here are some examples of those as well. Habitat might be, they're in different places. One lives in the water, one lives in the desert. They're never going to come in contact. Temporal isolation, they're out at different times. One might be spring, one might be fall. Behavioral, they might have different songs. Mechanical just means that it just won't work physically. And then gametic means that it just won't work in terms of an egg and a sperm coming together. All of these are example of pre-zygotic. No zygote is being made in any of these situations. Whereas post-zygotic, either the hybrid itself is not super viable, or the offspring can't have children, or the offspring doesn't really survive or work well. Species have been defined in other ways. So they have been roughly defined based on their morphology or their ecology or their phylogenetics. So just knowing that there are kind of different ways to define it. Usually we do it in terms of being able to reproduce. Speciation, the origin of species or making new species, can happen in two different ways. So there is something called allopatric, and then there is something called sympatric speciation. Allopatric has to do with geographical isolation. So we learned about prezygotic barriers, and geography is one of them. So there is a geographical barrier between them. And this is caused by geologic events. There's a volcano, there's a mountain, there's some physical barrier between them. And therefore, over time, the environment changes, natural selection acts on those two populations, the genes start to drift in those two independent populations, and then eventually, if you were to somehow put them back together, all those years later, they wouldn't be able to reproduce anymore. And therefore, they've become different species. That's different than sympatric. Sym means same. So they're actually living together in the same home. They do have overlapping populations, but the barriers might be sexual selection, or it might be habitat differentiation. So they live in the same forest, but maybe they live in different parts of the tree within the same forest. And so then eventually, even though they're living in the same area, they become different enough over time that they don't reproduce anymore. Okay, so here's roughly what that looks like in picture form. You might have an instance where on the left you had one species, and now you have this barrier pop up that's geographically separating the two into two different ponds, and eventually they become different over time. Whereas at the right, sympatric, they can actually still go between the two, but maybe now we have some kind of behavioral selection. So, the blue ones might only want to be with the blue ones, or so on. Here's an example of the allopatric speciation. The two squirrels. There was a canyon between them. Once upon a time, they had a common ancestor and they were one singular species. But because they've been isolated from each other so long, they've naturally selected and evolved differently. So now if you put them together, they won't interbreed. Sympatric is another example of where there might be some kind of genetic changes that result in new species being created. I did mention once upon a time that plants are polyploidy, meaning sometimes non-disjunction occurs and they end up with like a whole extra set of chromosomes. Well, now you have gametic isolation. You've created these things that are way different than what existed before. So even though they're not geographically in a separate spot, they are still able to speciate. Okay. So strawberries are an example of that. It is possible to make hybrids, right? We start mixing fruits and all kinds of crazy things, but generally speaking, different things happen and we can get new species by changing the number of sets of chromosomes and having it be able to survive. And here's kind of a picture representation of that. So please understand that you can't just mix and match anything, but there are certain circumstances, for whatever reason, the hybrid can actually become viable. This doesn't work really with humans, but it does work a lot of times with plants. Okay, so great. Now we have something called adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation has to do with new species coming from a single common ancestor. So there's one common ancestor, and all of a sudden you have this increase in a bunch of different species being made in a short amount of time. This usually results from things like a mass extinction. So if you think about the dinosaur mass extinction 65 million years ago, that cleared a lot of land away. Like the dinosaurs dominated the earth and you wiped them all out. Well, now you have this wide open environment for all these like underground mammals to now survive. So they are able to now go into these new environments that they weren't able to go in before when the dinosaurs were there. And they don't have predators. They can essentially adaptive radiate. They take on all these new environments and then they can become all these new and different species. By taking on new and different areas. Or you can think about organisms that go to different islands and become geographically isolated. That would be another example of the Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos, those types of things. So it could be geographical. It could be the result of new niches or environments for survivors. So here's an example in Hawaii. Hawaiian plants all came from a tarweed like 5 million years ago, but then they ended up on all these different islands, and then natural selection has caused them to radiate into those different environments and become many new and different species. All right, so there is something called a hybrid zone where there are reproductive barriers, but they're not complete, meaning it's not a total block. So you might have a population, a gene flow, some kind of barrier, and then there can be some hybrids that do result. And it can either become stable or it can become fused, meaning that they might go back together to be the same population, or they might stay diverged. So it just kind of depends. Here's an example. There are grizzly bears and there are polar bears. These are two distinct populations. They look very different, but it is possible to have a growlar or a pizzly, however you want to call it, that is a hybrid. So that's kind of like the hybrid zone. And it's possible due to climate change that maybe that's going to now be kind of the singular species, and really these two will meld back together and be one, or it could possibly be reinforced. These are fertile. Okay, so in terms of time of evolution, we've talked previously about gradualism with the idea of slow, constant changes over time, where there's a common ancestor. But then we just talked about this adaptive radiation idea, where maybe there's an extinction and now we have all of these new environmental areas open for organisms to come in and speciate. So that's where the idea of punctuated equilibrium comes in. There might be a long period of stasis, and then it's punctuated by these short bursts over time, a short amount of time. So some kind of change in the environment maybe then caused a dramatic shift, and then it stays kind of the same for a while, and then there's a dramatic shift. Here's kind of what that looks like with butterflies, for example. There might have been an abrupt change, and then we've had these for a really long time, versus just very, very slow shifting changes. And there is room for both in terms of the large-scale evolution that has taken place. Certain mass events can cause punctuated equilibrium, whereas others could be a more gradual pattern. But generally speaking, in terms of evolution, punctuated is usually the more accepted pattern.